Today, we're going to talk about the election. Now, I looked at that and said, let's look at it pretty broadly. We'll be joined by Lawrence Lessig. Lawrence Lessig is a professor at Stanford Law School, and he is the founder of Creative Commons, which he then turned around. As the leader of that movement a few months ago, he just turned on a dime and started another organization, and this one is called Change Congress. And so we will be talking about what led him to do that and what his hopes for Change Congress are. Lawrence Lessig.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, my first question, Lawrence, is I ran into you over the last few years a few times when your mission, your work, it seemed to be you were the figure of Creative Commons. What was that movement, and what did you accomplish?
Well, it still is a movement. In fact, it's growing quite substantially. It's part of a movement of a bunch of activists who are trying to restore some balance to the regulation of culture that copyright law tries to affect. We've seen a very radical increase in the effort of the government to control, using copyright, the development and spread of culture. And Creative Commons is just one movement that tries to step in to create a balance. And it did that by asking copyright owners to voluntarily release some of their rights. So not all of their rights, but basically mark their creative work with the freedoms they intended it to carry, so that people knew they were, for example, allowed to share the work, or they could use it for non-commercial purposes, whatever the author said, but allowed people to take advantage of the great potential of digital technology without infringing the underlying copyright. So we launched that about 5.5 years ago, and it's exploded to a couple 100 million objects now licensed by Creative Commons licenses, and the project has sister chapters in 45 countries around the world, and has raised the funding it needs for the next 5 years to function.
Excellent.
So I figured we're at a stage where it's time, it's going to succeed, and now time for a new problem.
That is my next question. Someone who has devoted themselves as you did to that and mobilized people, built alliances, as you say, left them with money in the bank. What happened for you, to you, that, as I say, to some it appeared you turned on a dime to this new mission? Well,
Creative Commons was one part of a whole bunch of things I was doing about copyright. And what hit me, it's a very obvious point. It should have hit me a long time ago. But what hit me here was recognition that the kind of problems we were facing with the copyright issues were caused by the same sort of thing that was causing problems in other fundamentally important areas of public policy, like, for example, global warming or healthcare or nutrition. In all of these areas, the government was getting things fundamentally wrong because of a distorting influence of money in the process by which we elect candidates to office. So, in the copyright area, Congress was getting fundamental mistakes about public policy. Mistakes not about hard questions, but about easy questions, because the debate was dominated by those who were most prolific in their contributions to Congress, and people on the other side, people defending the public domain who had no place in the money, didn't get a hearing because they didn't get access, because they didn't have the keys to get access, which was contributions. Same thing, the story of extraordinary story about global warming, which 10 or 15-year delay in America of waking up to this fact and doing something about it, largely the product of funding by oil companies to produce junk science and members of Congress who would ignore the science. Again, this is a problem tied to the problem of money. So recognizing that, below each of the particular problems that many people were focused on, there was an underlying problem that was really much more significant and fundamental that we had to address. That led me to think, okay, it's time to try to deal with that more fundamental problem.
I've listened to some of your speeches online, and you point out some of the easy ones. Global warming was one. Can you mention a couple of others? Because what you said is, the original idea of representative government is that perhaps there are some issues that are just so complicated that our representatives need to meet and deliberate rather than the common man. But you say actually they've made huge mistakes on what are obviously easy issues.
Yeah, I mean, the one that I've been looking at recently is really quite astonishing, is question of nutrition. Experts have a pretty clear consensus that we eat too much sugar-based food, food with added sugar. We don't eat enough, healthy food like vegetables and unprocessed food. Health organizations have been pushing governments to try to get people to adopt a healthier diet. And the WHO in 2003 set standards that said people should eat no more than 10% of their daily caloric intake from added sugar. The sugar industry in America went ballistic when they heard this, and they got members of the Senate to threaten to withdraw funding from the WHO if they didn't back down from what they considered to be that outrageous position, and instead adopt the position that they wanted, which was that your daily caloric intake should include something like 25% of calories coming from added sugar. Well, under the Bush administration, the United States government has adopted exactly that position, 25% of your daily caloric intake coming from added sugar, which means, according to our government, a balanced diet would start with Fruit Loops or M&Ms for breakfast, a glass of milk, a cheeseburger for lunch, 3 slices of pepperoni pizza for dinner, plus sugar cookies for dessert. That's a balanced diet, according to our government.
Well, that is the American diet, Lawrence.
Unfortunately, that is. But the point is, what gets the government to this ridiculous position was the fact that the people on the committee voting had a direct interest to the sugar industry and to the candy industry, right? And so here again, you've got government supposed to be addressing these basic issues and getting them right, and it can't because of this pervasive corrupting influence.
Right. One thing that I did several shows on was the Farm Bill, and the Farm Bill was an improvement this year with more money for nutrition, more money for things we actually eat rather than just grain crops, but they could not break the political logjam to stop subsidizing enormously the grain crops of agribusiness. Similarly, we can look at what's happening with energy policy, et cetera, et cetera. It's very clear. So you said, all the good we can do, all the advocacy, all the intelligence even that we might put into play, if we don't change Congress, isn't going to make a difference. What does change Congress do? And what is it? What? Once you have that insight, once you say we've got to do it, what are the steps you're taking?
Well, what we want to do is to build a movement, citizens and candidates, and hopefully members of Congress, who take the first step of pledging themselves to a platform of reform. So we've, in the first iteration of this, identified 4 possible planks of that reform. One of them is that you pledge, as the Democratic Party has now pledged, not to accept money from lobbyists or PACs. Number 2, you pledge support for fundamental reform of the earmark system, possibly abolishing earmarks. Number 3, you support public funding of public elections. And number 4, you support a significant increase in the transparency in the way Congress actually functions. So you go to our site and you could select which of those 4 planks you believe in. You could select all 4, you could select 1, you could select any subset that you believe. That gives you a little tag that you can put on your website, or if you're a candidate, on your candidate's website, that shows what kind of reform candidate you are. We then were going to build this army of wiki workers who are going to go out there and tag every member and every candidate along, the axes of these 4 planks. Where do they stand on each of these 4 issues? And then build a map of reform, like where do people stand and what's the picture of reform in the nation around these issues. And then finally, we're building technology to put into place a kind of Emily's list so that candidates who support reform will get funded by people who also support reform. There'll be a simple way to identify who it is you should be supporting if you believe in reform, and we'll be driving money towards those candidates. So that's the basic mechanism that we've put together so far.
Okay, and if I'm not mistaken, the first archived blogs, for instance, go back to March 2008. Is that about when this began?
Yeah, so it's March 2008 that I made the first kind of public lecture at this thing down in San Diego about it, and that's where that's about the time we began.
So it's very new, and I was curious, what role is Joe Trippi playing? Joe Trippi, people may remember, was the person who revolutionized the relationship of campaigns to the internet in his involvement with the Dean campaign.
Yeah, so Joe and I really were the ones who sat down and said, we need to do something about this, and so how do we do it? So he and I, he's been instrumental in figuring out the strategy of getting this going, and continues to play a significant role in that. But I think that, what we both recognize is that we've got to broaden the appeal here quite substantially. It's not going to be enough just to have people who are considered liberals in the game. We'll only get real reform if we see substantial connection to Republicans as well.
Right. Now, I notice that you've had at least one candidate take the pledge and win an election, Shelley Pingree?
Yeah, that's right, in Maine.
And she is now the candidate for Congress, right?
Right.
Okay. And Shelley, for people, has been on my show several times, speaking when she was in her role as head of Common Cause for several years. And she and I remember had a conversation in which I said something very similar to what you're saying, which was that unless we got what I call the democracy trifecta, everything else we did for the environment, for health care, for education, et cetera, wouldn't really work. And that was media reform, campaign reform, and election reform. And it seems to me you're taking on the piece of campaign reform.
That's right. And I completely agree with you in your prediction there.
Yeah, and so you were at the Media Reform Conference recently and gave a speech on Change Congress. Who when you look out there is doing the election reform? Brennan Center and those folks?
The Brennan Center is critical in doing election reform, and there's a whole wide range of organizations that are pushing various components of that. But I'm been particularly impressed by a group called Fair Vote, which has maybe 25 different election reform related issues which they've been pushing from the way in which votes get counted, runoff procedures, to redistricting and electoral college issues, all of which I think sap people, the problems in each of these areas sap people's faith in the underlying system.
Besides change-congress.org, are there other places people can go to learn more? Is that the place where they go?
That's the key place.
They choose their pledge, and then as it was clear you made out, this isn't about going to an online site once and saying I pledge. This is about becoming a part of a social change network, correct?
Exactly right. You got to join, and then you got to be part of this effort to get more people involved to do the same.
Very good. Okay. Lawrence, I hope to talk to you again as we get closer to the general election and talk about how many candidates have taken the pledge, how they're doing, and that sort of thing. And I salute you for the work you're doing.
I appreciate that. Thanks very much.